Hello and welcome to Traffic Cop Final Sprint uh, and Build Demo, I guess. I'm just gonna go ahead and stick in the editor for a bit here and do a fly around to show off some of the newly built assets. As you can see, the specularity on most of these objects is kind of high. Um, that's going to be a stage point for a later minigame, Bottle Toss. This is a prototype of the duck chute. The actual model, working model, is on a different level. Here's the balloon pop, some cotton candy, carousel, big tent. We even have the Ferris wheel. So then over here we've actually done a good bit of the level design to give kind of an example of how the level design would eventually look at in final. Over here, as you can see, we have a completed truck, the candy shop. We have the completed van over here, rather than the gray stand-ins that we use for the game demo portion. Over here we have the where I think that's the tool shop. We have the telephone booth, street lights. We have the rails over here, and this here, for the sake of it, is the actual completed rail setup with the final metallic coating on it. The barber shop, another completed and colored and textured truck. Um, some brick buildings here. So we have the brownstone building, the three-story brownstone building. Then we have the looks like it's a 6 or 7 story brownstone high-rise, I guess. Is that, if that's what you want to call it? So for art assets, it looks like we've just put a little more polish on some of the existing assets, as well as built a more realistic skyline using the assets that we've developed over the course of the project. As you can see, we've fleshed out the level quite a bit more with physical assets to make it feel more lived in. The low poly art style was specifically chosen for the values that it provides when you port it to a smaller hardware system like the Quest 2, because the Quest 2 operates independently of a computer, but it has some fairly finite resources. So going into development of a game with the Quest 2 as the target platform in mind, we had to keep in mind the limitations of the system. So that's why all the art style is geared towards being the most poly-effective and poly-efficient possible due to the limited number of resources that the Quest 2 has. We want to make sure that when we deploy it to the Quest 2, that simply spawning in a couple more objects or having this much scenery in it isn't going to suck up most of the system resources. So, well, with some of the stationary objects, we actually went kind of rich with the poly count. With the spawnable objects, we actually were rather miserly with our poly count in order to make sure that we could have 20 or 100 of them spawn on screen at once without crashing the entire game or overloading the Quest 2 headset. So as we go around here, I'll go ahead and switch to the duck chute. So an individual game level, as you can see here with the duck chute as the example, we'll actually switch to a different level area, so it'll unload all the other assets in the main traffic guidance level, so that those assets aren't clogging up the system resources. We might eventually just do like a photo backdrop here somewhere in order to mimic it with maybe a couple foreground objects, just so that you maintain that level of immersion. But the goal for this is that with the Carnival games, you'll be able to come in here and play a single specific game, and we'll only have the assets loaded for that, and maybe a couple assets for backdrop. But aside from that, this is the current state of the build. So I'll go ahead and, as you can see here, we have the manhole cover, service access cover, and not really certain which term they want me to use, but so here's the UAT cover, here's the cones at the end of the row that section it off. That physics object is supposed to be grabbable. Let's go ahead and pop up here. So here, showing off the build that we have done so far. You can see the vehicles spawn in, and they have a distance finder using a raycast in order to determine what is and is not in front of them. I went ahead and changed it so that they don't deliberately collide with one another, just as a matter of course, but if you're not properly controlling the traffic, they do. A lot of that just had to deal with the basic game traffic controls and getting a dumb enough AI built. The vehicles look a little bit small because the assets were rescaled and the roads were actually made wider during the most recent builds. And all the assets that you see in here now, aside from the explosions, were all custom built by the team for this project specifically. And the explosions themselves are a open entity. They're actually from the Unreal store as the free use assets. But other than that, the explosions working well, the collisions are working well, the vehicles move around in a sensible navigational method using some easily scalable waypoint designs. As you can see here, by pressing I, K, or J, I can actually, or I, J, and L, I can actually start and stop traffic. In an actual VR implementation for this, you would do it by making a gesture in a given cardinal direction. But due to the repeated necessity of the game having to be demoed using a mouse and keyboard on a regular desktop, the key assignments for the various traffic stopping, traffic indication was established for the sake of using a keyboard and mouse instead of the VR system. We're also having to work over or rework the blueprint for the virtual reality controller pawn because the base pawn for interacting with the world wasn't sufficient to support the innovations that we made with VR hand and gesture tracking. And it was felt that gesture tracking was very important for this game because gesture tracking is one of the new things, and it clearly showcases the capabilities of the Oculus Quest 2 more than just using a trigger point or a button press would. So that pawn is still in development. But otherwise, where it comes to the game and the development of the mechanics, we have all of the main mechanics for the gameplay already staged and set up. So future development is probably going to be facilitated through, I want to say mostly, it's going to be facilitated through, yeah, very important. It's going to be to add in additional mini games as well as polish up the remaining mechanics for the traffic cop game itself. So right now we have the ability to control and direct traffic coming through an intersection, explosions when the vehicles collide with one another, and the various mechanics necessary to facilitate the destruction of the objects, the interactions with one another, the way that the AI works in getting the vehicles to stop when the one in front of them stops properly at an intersection, getting the mechanics in place so that when the vehicle in front stops, the vehicles behind it also stop. When they restart, all the vehicles behind them also restart. And a lot of that is just some complex carryover of AI interactions using a ray trace multi-line path feedback. But the other main mechanics that we'll be implementing are also going to be pedestrians crossing from this corner to that corner, which won't be that difficult due to the fact that the AI components necessary for those to take place already exist. And having a walk gesture and the implementations of the characters skinned and developed and designed already has existed. The design documents and the art for it already exists. It just hasn't been implemented as a game object yet. But as you can see, the AI works quite well when it comes to the collisions and everything else. And the biggest aspect of the AI for the game itself was making an AI dumb enough that it would run into another vehicle during the gameplay. Because, and this is largely just because the Unreal Engine itself and the pathfinding AI it has would typically have them avoiding a collision with one another due to the ability of them being able to see one another and recognize additional world dynamic objects as they're listed inside of the game. And the AI in the Unreal game was smart enough that with the regular pathfinding, the vehicles would actually avoid one another, which was contrary to the design needs of the game document and the wishes of the product owner. So for the current game build that we have, the vehicles when they collide with one another will actually collide with one another and explode, as you've seen here repeatedly. But also, as the vehicles move through, they will not attempt to avoid one another, and that's because of a deliberately dumbed down AI in order to deliberately induce collisions and crashes and explosions as part of the necessary gameplay mechanics. So as you can see here, I'll just go ahead and zoom in right here. This is where the player would normally stand, and they would be able to make a gesture going that way or that way or that way to start or stop traffic. One of the other additional mechanics of gameplay that is to be implemented is that there's supposed to be like a patience timer, so that when a vehicle has been sitting there for too long, it'll attempt to run the intersection, and that'll lead to collisions just like this happening right in front of the player. So from the player's perspective, when the two vehicles collide, this is what they'll end up seeing. And that will be one of the failure indications for the game itself. As you can see here, the vehicles are making their turns and everything else and moving through the intersection, and when they fail to properly move through the intersection, they'll collide with one another and explode just like that. So later implementations of the game could also include additional pathways. So as you're already seeing here, they're making a left turn from here to over to here. But another thing we could do is the vans here could end up making a right-hand turn from where they're over on this edge up this path, and that would allow for more additional possibilities of collision, which would require greater player attentiveness. But instead of and the all directional control, which is all the traffic from, let's say, cardinally the north end of the street, where these Chevy-esque models are coming from, goes all at once. Whereas before you had to individually guide the cars one at a time, that was felt to be not necessarily reflective of how real world traffic cops work, and also seen to be tedious. So instead of having it so that you have to control every single car individually, this is a lot more along the lines of the final game mechanic that you're seeing right now, where in which you can just let all the traffic from a single direction or multiple directions go at once. And that is how the traffic control would work. So I gesture up towards the north cardinal here with like a come here motion, and all the traffic from the north cardinal would begin moving towards me. And just like the traffic off to my right here, if I gestured with the come hither to the right, all the traffic from my right would be coming towards me, or the east cardinal, as it is right now. And the main reason that we implemented this change in the gameplay mechanics from the original mechanics was it was it's more fun, and it's more reflective of a realistic situation. So when you have a gameplay like when you have a game like Traffic Cop, you're running kind of a cartoony job simulator, where in which you're stepping into the shoes of Traffic Cop, and directing cars one at a time wasn't necessarily reflective of either the real world Traffic Cop, and it was, if I'm going to be honest, it wasn't very fun, because there's a lot of tedium directing the cars one or two at a time that was taking away from the gameplay mechanics. And while there is additional gameplay mechanics like the vehicles throwing stuff at the player when they lose patience and they run an intersection in order to show their displeasure to the player, and the player being able to catch those and throw them back at the drivers that run the intersection, it wasn't necessarily fun to have to guide the cars one at a time due to the complexity of the controls of selecting a car and moving it across the intersection or moving it across to its destination. And since the mechanic of individual car guidance was taken away from the fun of the gameplay, it was exchanged for a everything from this direction navigation method. And well, it works. The vehicles move across, they collide, they make their turns, they don't make their turns, they run into the car in front of them, they run into the car behind them. Design-wise, we can actually scale and change these. The distance that they stop between one another isn't an absolute fixed distance between them or the vans. You can actually change the amount of distance they have between stopping, so that when the vehicle in front of them is stopped, they stop as well, but the distance varies. And that was to give the game a more realistic look and feel, and make it feel like the cars were actually being driven by something intelligent. They weren't just like completely bot based. Just mostly bot based. But aside from that, our central game mechanics are in place. The additional game mechanics and the mini games are still under development, but that was to be expected. All in all, the current state of gameplay is fairly satisfactory. The VR implementations are pretty hard to showcase on a keyboard and mouse setup, as is the current condition of the build. But that's to be expected. This has been Eric Marshall doing a presentation of the current state of Traffic Cop 2.0. Thank you for your time.